If you see anybody hanging around outside, tell them to come in. Right, so Paul Neal went straight from his talk into like a multitude of questions, so he's already answered quite a lot of things. I've seen a really active Twitter stream going on about this. Quite a positive Twitter stream.
Really? Twitter is very positive.
In fact, the one that I liked the most was Adrienne, who Neil put up a slide saying, learning analytics have politics, and she went, yes, 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 hell yes. So that's the sort of degree of enthusiasm we're getting out of some of the people here. Other people going, oh yeah, there were 30% I didn't agree with. So all sorts of different things going on. So we've got half an hour now to quiz Neil, and then we'll have a bit of a peace and quiet after that, I should think. So who's got?
Can I just? I very subtly set it up that you're not meant to quiz me, but we can just have a brilliant discussion amongst ourselves. And by ourselves, I mean you can all just talk with each other. So my ideal aim of this is for me not to say anything. So I haven't really got any more to say, but feel free to start conversation off. But if anyone else wants to answer it instead of us, that'd be great, because I've said enough.
So we are still recording. I don't know if we've got any microphones out there. Is somebody microphoning? Somebody's microphoning. So if you put your hand up and you're the next question, we're going to get you to wait until you've got a microphone. Otherwise, it's going to be really confusing for anybody watching the video. So we've got somebody with a microphone.
G'day, I'm a bit different to some of the people at the conference because I'm actually a data analyst at a secondary school rather than a university. And one of the things we're fighting against in the secondary school sector is the use of data for marketing purposes, to pull out a whole lot of data about student performance and mainly student performance, to say, send your children to this school because this is our score for this and this is our NAP plan for this, etc., etc. And it's sort of gone away from concentrating on improving student learning. It's hard because that's a change that has to be a collective of all school principals to not do that. And to survive, sometimes they've got to market their school in a highly competitive educational marketplace. They've got to use data to try and sell their school to prospective parents. So it's a problem that I can see, and it's one of the negatives of data use in education, I think, that it's used for marketing purposes. So I don't know if it's a question or just an observation.
No, it's really interesting because it relates back to the issues which I was trying to raise before about the wider context of education. So you're right. I mean, it's not just the school's fault, though. So in Australia, there's that My School website where all of the publicly accessible data about performance is collated, and then parents are encouraged, or actually they do have to go along, type in the name of your school, and they'll get a whole bunch of analytics to then compare. So the fact that schools are then fighting back with their own presentation of the data is completely understandable, because that's just how the system is. And it's exactly the same in the university sector as well. Rebecca and I were talking before about in the universities that we work in, my area, people are very critical about data, and we have all these metrics and we're ranked in the world. And then as soon as we do well in the rankings, they're the first people to tweet, we're number 14 in the world, aren't we? It's like, well, you can't slag data off and metrics off and then start using them when it suits you. But that's just, as you say, one school can't stop doing it because otherwise you lose competitive advantage. But I think if we can start conversations with other schools and with parents and everyone else about what's going on here. So one tactic might be to start having these alternative metrics, just having more data. This is, NAP plan results are one thing, but on the other hand, here are some measures of, and then things you think are actually valuable. It might be enjoyment or fun or, whatever. And it at least then gets people thinking about there are lots of different data points. And then you might start questioning why we're using data altogether. I was reading something, I'm not going to be able to give you the source for this, yesterday, and they were saying that parents, when they make choices on the basis of data, don't look at the school results or the educational results, they look at the socioeconomic characteristics of the school. They put much more weight on where the school is and whether they think it's a nice neighbourhood and a nice bunch of kids. The NAP plan results and stuff are less kind of persuasive, which is really interesting because you'd think they'd be kind of gunning for NAP plan. But it's a real big problem, so kind of we need to, make it visible, so people like you raising these concerns is really interesting because I've heard many schools saying that. making it more acceptable just to kind of first raise the issue, then question the issue, and then think about alternatives. I don't know whether you could have indicators which are not numerically based, for example. Just quotes from students. I love this school. I feel really happy here, really safe here. There are all sorts of other ways of promoting it. But you're right. Doing it on your own would be kind of commercial suicide. But it's because education in Australia, in schools in Australia, is now a marketplace, and it's set up around data. So what can you do?
Okay, so I've seen a couple of hands go up. There was one behind Simon, and then Simon, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Neil, for your talk this morning. I love a good, provocative presentation. I'm wanting to tease out, you mentioned notions of education as a collective good, and that's something that the whole of societies should be engaged in. And you also talked about notions of data ownership, which seems to me to sort of be inherently personal and commercial, and notions of property. And when we think about data ownership and we have questions about who owns data, I'm wondering if we're asking the wrong question about these points of data. If we think about a group assignment in a higher ed context, is the assignment owned by the whole group or an individual, or is it owned by the faculty member who has designed that learning activity? And is that actually a helpful way of thinking about who has a stake in what is being interrogated in that kind of instance?
No, those are all really good points. And again, we were coming back to another conversation I was having with Rebecca about how in the UK the strike, all the academics are on strike, and some of the universities are using online video capture as a way of breaking the strike. As Rebecca was saying, intellectual property rights kind of lie with the lecturer, and some of the universities are realising they can't do this because the IP belongs to the lecturer. I know for a fact the IP of my lectures don't belong to me, or my PowerPoint slides or anything like that. So, I mean, yeah, in some ways there's kind of intellectual property issues there, but you're right. In some ways it's not about owning data. You can't own data. Data have a social life of their own, and they're reconstituted, recirculated, and in 10 years' time can end up being used for completely different purposes in completely different ways. So in some ways, I guess we need to think more carefully about who's gatekeeping the data rather than who's owning it per se. I'm not sure data can be owned particularly. But I think people have rights about data that are generated that are personal in as much as they're individually identified with the data. But whether it's owning it or whether it's having responsible gatekeepers, I certainly think there needs to be personally, a regulation. The whole idea of open data, I'm not sure what happened to that, whether that was just too idealistic or how that's kind of turning out. But if we all agreed that data was a kind of public collective good and it was just inherently open, then we wouldn't have any of these issues, would we? So the personalised learning push in education is really interesting because it's a very particular use of the word personalised. And what I might think of personalised is completely different. So there are some examples of this. Domain of one's own is quite interesting in the US, where they've got this argument that when you go to the university, you get given your own website, and all the content that you produce goes to that website. And when you graduate with that website and that content. So if you, as a student, have produced an assignment on your own, that's yours. Now, when it's a group assignment, then I guess it becomes a bit more tricky. But there are ways of kind of thinking more interestingly about this. So it doesn't just disappear or get sucked up somewhere else. But yeah, for us to treat data in education as an open, publicly accessible collective good means that we have to completely reorientate our whole views about society and education. It's nothing to do with that data. That's just a broader question, isn't it? And I guess some of you here must have been involved in more open data, open education movements. So I guess you know far more about this than I do. But I think we've moved so far away from those ideals. That's depressing, isn't it? I was meant to be upbeat.
Okay. So I think the next person I saw was Simon, and then I think Kirsty had her hand up after that.
Okay, thank you, Neil, for that. It was very provocative. I think it will be very generative for how we think about what we're doing in the future. There's really a comment back to our schools colleague here. So you said, there's no such thing as raw data, Neil. Jeff Bowker has this beautiful expression, raw data is an oxymoron. It must be cooked with care. And then we had David Schaefer on Wednesday telling us, it's all about meaning. It's not, data doesn't speak, it's all about meaning. It's what we invest into it. So, when I was a school governor in the UK, subject to, this intense regime of data-intensive league tabling, etc., we took a decision as a school. We wanted to subvert the way we were being portrayed by the data league table. We wanted to provide our own narrative around the data. So we can't hide the data from parents. They go look it up on the government website. But we put the data up on our school website with our narrative around it. Because many parents don't know how to read that stuff anyway. And we want them to understand, this is saying this. There are all sorts of limitations around that. You need to understand that we measure success in a whole bunch of other ways that are currently invisible on the government website. Okay, so we create a counter-narrative, as well as actually educate people coming to the data literacy thing as well. So, that's just the school's example, and that's something very practical you can do if your school leadership wants to nail its colours to particular values. But that's something that we can do ourselves. There's the dashboard, but what's the meaning that someone's going to take from it? We need to make sure that we're doing the best data storytelling we can around that to help people draw the right kinds of conclusions from it, if we have a view about what the right conclusions are, of course.
And I also love the idea about allowing students to do that. So allowing students to create their own alt metrics, to create a counter-narrative against the learning analytics that you're saying, we know this about you, and they can come back with a bunch of other stuff. So it's just kind of screwing around with it a bit and making it less objective. But I'd love the idea of students to come up with their own learning analytics.
Okay, can you pass back to Kirsty? And then Kirsty, can you pass back to Rosie after that?
Okay. Thanks for the talk. It was really nice, and it brought together a lot of really nice concepts in learning analytics. One of the things that I think as a field we struggle with is lag. So there's this problem where essentially new people are entering the field all the time, and the first thing they do is they approach sort of organisational perspectives of learning analytics, which is by and large what you were addressing with your talk. And gradually, as the groups mature and people sort of see more of the field and they interface with more of the other groups in the field, sort of the perspective shifts and they become much more sophisticated in the analytics they're doing. And in fact, when it came to your list, I was thinking, well, I know probably about half of those things are being actively pursued by different groups around the field. But when it comes to, for example, senior decision makers or that external perspective of what the field is doing, there's this lag and this sort of misperception. And I think this is something we really struggle to face and to sort of counteract because we don't want people to be thinking about us like that. But obviously that's where a lot of the dollars are, and that's where a lot of the sort of, impact is likely to be at the moment. And that's where a lot of the really dangerous things are going on. So I'm wondering, more broadly than beyond, like just Neil, how do we address this? So, the new people who are here this year, is analytics just about organisational predictive analytics? There were lots of talks about that. How many other talks have you seen that are doing other things? Like, how do we push that beyond? Like, more of a question. You can answer that.
Right, we're taking that as a statement rather than a question.
I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, people could address that as we go around. Yeah. Sorry, we're going there and then there and then there and then there. Does that make sense? So 1, 2, 3, 4 speakers lined up. Yeah?
You could tweet your responses.
Yeah, and you can tweet. Yeah.
Okay, so my question is a little bit, thank you for a wonderful talk. You were arguing very convincingly that we have some problems in being like apolitical and objective in a sense. It's not possible to do that. And I was thinking that this kind of criticism that you raise against learning analytics can maybe be put towards any attempt to improve education in a sensible, rational way where we all agree, and that gives us the problem that what kind of educational politics is that? What are we doing then? And of course, that's all fine if you are raising our level of awareness. But as you were arguing, it's like a big movement that are pushing back on the use of data, the use of reasoning in improving education, and that can be a problem, because then what we are agreeing on is maybe just doing nothing, or I don't know. So
yeah, I was going to. I certainly wasn't saying you're apolitical. Learned this when I went to work in London. I used to always be very critical about education technology. Never really knew what education technology was. And then I went to work in this London knowledge lab with a lot of education technologists, Steiner Laurelard, Richard Noss, all these people, to learn about what education technology was. And they were some of the most, I mean, not necessarily those two, but they were some of the most politically minded people I'd ever met. They were all ex-Marxists. They'd all been kind of protesting in 1960, whenever it was. And, you know, they were all really, they're not stupid at all, but they were just doing technology in a particular way that wasn't bringing their own personal politics into it. I'm certainly not saying that anything I've just talked about you hadn't thought about or known about, but it's just not on the agenda. So I wasn't saying you're apolitical, but maybe the way these things are being talked about and are just massively taking off. So I agree, in some ways these are issues which are just experienced by any attempt to improve or change education. And yours is the particular flavour of the month. And I know you've got George Siemens in your kind of community, and I guess MOOCs is a previous example that had great potential and was really interesting when it started off, and then suddenly it's turned into something completely different. And it's all to do with values and ideals and the politics of now MOOCs. So I can see learning analytics possibly going the same way. I don't know if that's a fair analogy to draw, but maybe in 10 years' time it's just going to be super systems run by these big companies that, and you guys are going to be saying, oh, well, back in the day, LAK was a kind of alternative version to learning analytics that was a bit more thoughtful. And that's a worry, because are we just caught in this cycle of great idealistic, small-scale stuff that grows and grows, and then all of a sudden it just gets taken off? That's a shame. So I guess we could just say, yeah, this happens all the time, and these are just problems to do with changing education. But maybe this is a space, because of the malleable nature of data and the way that it's not, you know, completely fixed in stone, there are ways of being a bit more alternate or critical or pushing back, or, you know, I don't know, maybe this is a moment, or maybe I'm just being a bit idealistic myself. But you're right, none of this is particularly unique to LAK. And also, it's everything I've said up there. I could have gone to a health conference and talked about health analytics, or I could have gone to a criminal justice conference and talked about criminal analytics. It's all the same kind of issues. But education's something, it's, you know, I feel passionate about education because it's young people's life chances that we're talking about here. And it's also this very personal kind of thing. So it's an interesting area, but there's nothing unique about it at all.
Okay, so I think somebody at the back's got the mic there, and then I think Jen, and then I think Hendrik, and then in front there. Yeah, so.
Oh, you go.
No, I just want to give my opinion on what she asked about the people who are arriving in this community. So it's my first time here in LAK, and I've been to EDM and AI Ed, so it's much more data-centric. And my experience here is that I think it's a really good community to start thinking about other questions much more than those data-centric communities. And I think there's a lot of students thinking about this perspective that, okay, what this means, what this data means. So one example is like Molly, which over there from Melbourne, we start thinking about, okay, let's ask the students what they think about this data. So I'm quite positive with the community, and I think it's well, even to invite a person which from outside the community, I think is quite good. So I think it's a good place to start thinking about this, and people are, not everyone, but a lot of people are open to these new ideas.
I wanted to pick up on Kirsty's reply to Kirsty's point as well, because we've been talking about this a bit, but I think it ties together a number of things that we've heard actually over the last 3 days. I've heard a lot about values at this conference. We've talked a lot about the role of women in LAK and in data science more generally, and celebrated International Women's Day together yesterday. We've talked a little bit about the fact that we're sitting in a Freemasons hall as well. But that's been an interesting conversation. So I guess this is my second LAK. and my first experience was also very values driven. It was in Edinburgh, and we had Paul Kirshner's keynote as well. What would LAK's role in advocacy be here? And it ties to Simon's point about controlling the narrative of what learning analytics is, because I think inside this community we all see that it's a very rich, very diverse field. It's not as narrow, but the commercial narrative and the narrative we hear at other conferences, I'm a learning technologist, and when I go to more kind of operational conferences, it's a very different story, it's a very different narrative, and it's a very different set of perspectives on what learning analytics is. So what's the role that LAK should play to not end up where MOOCs ended up? How can we hold on to the narrative now and push a different perspective? Because if we can't do it, I don't know that anybody can do it. This is where the diversity of opinion is.
That's exactly what I was trying to say. But you took 60 seconds to say it, and I took 60 minutes. No, that's perfect.
But available for keynotes.
People, yeah.
Short ones.
You are exactly the type of people. I mean, I'm not going to drag on. It's just moved to Monash, and everyone in Monash is super excited. We've got this learning analytics superstar, and everyone just wants him to just change the world. And he's in such a powerful position to shape what that institution understands learning analytics to be. And no one knows, and what they think it is before him coming is just crazy, because it's just all over the shop. So you guys, people would look to you as the academic experts and the leaders in this field. They're not saying that you're building the things and selling the things, but you've got this really privileged position, and that's kind of what I was trying to get at in the end, was this could be a really interesting expert space to push back against these other things. And as you say, control the narrative, maybe set new narratives, set the agenda, and just have that would be such a kind of powerful thing to do, because people don't know what they're talking about, and they're looking for people to tell them what to think. So go for it.
So once again, thank you for a great talk. Hendrik Draxler, my name. I was wondering, you said we should be critical friends and we can leave the development to the industry. And I wanted to step in onto that because I get kind of this request. In the Netherlands, a lot of publishers go into learning analytics and stuff, and then you get meetings like that. They invite you to come. They show you their data set, their dashboard, and they say, see, this is our dashboard. Can you give us a theory for it that supports it? So, and then you're really puzzled. I mean, you sit there, you basically have to tell them, well, this is actually totally the wrong way to do it, right? And I'm really wondering, so I also believe strongly in that we as academics should shape systems. We should make tangible systems to give people also an idea where analytics could go to, how it should look like. And otherwise you get it, typically these industry people that go into the classroom, they see 30 kids sitting there, one person talking, and they just replicate that digitally and put another brick into the wall. So really innovating education, what we're aiming for, and providing a system that then really supports people and looks for their needs and so on, is really a challenging thing. And I think we need to make these developments still. We need to do it to give an example for that. And one thing I'm wondering about is, we can do that now with GDPR in Europe. I mean, we have clear guidelines how to do it. We build up a kind of trusted learning analytics systems and try to experiment with that. But getting the culture of a nation into it and building up trust for them is much harder. And I was wondering if you could share some thoughts on that, how to get culture, feeling, and trust into something like this that is already intended to serve them in a trusted way.
Yeah, that's an easy question, isn't it? How can I develop trust across Europe? I was going to go back to your first point. The idea about LAK or communities like this being a place to develop plausible alternatives is really, really powerful. And all right, you'll have these idiot companies coming, make our dashboard better, but you'll also have people like the guy next to you who's expressed a need and an interest and who's more open to kind of thinking otherwise. If you worked with him, I'm saying he might do some work for you for free, by the way. If you work with him to develop a plausible alternative that then is a kind of proof of concept or a proof of alternate concept, that's a really powerful thing to be doing. So, yeah, if a company's asking you to have a second dial on their dashboard, then, yeah, personally, I wouldn't waste my time doing it. But there are other people that are hungry for other alternatives, so that could be a really interesting role to play. The culture thing is key, isn't it? And so in some ways, I don't particularly like Black Mirror or any of those things, but things like that are really important in shaping kind of people's understandings and shared understandings of what data are. And so things like the European directive now is beginning to make, at least people are pricking up their ears and taking attention. And it's something that people don't know how to react to because they've never thought about the issue before. So the EU suddenly coming down really heavy-handed. There's this vacuum in the kind of public discourse where people like you, the learning analytics community, can kind of step in and say, well, hang on a minute, we know something about this as opposed to when it applies to education. And here are some of the issues. And just so in some ways that involves you guys and all of us getting involved with talking with the media, being more proactive, having a voice outside of a Masonic temple or whatever this is, and real kind of promoting ourselves in a kind of public understanding of data and public understanding of data and education. So actually some of the more fruitful groups that I've done bits and bobs with are teaching unions, for example, who are really beginning to experience some of these issues at the pointy end and really want some alternative ways of speaking back. And just saying slightly different things in public can kind of empower people like that because they can say, I've been kind of feeling that. I didn't know you could say it out loud, and the fact that someone's saying it out loud from a university, it's really. So I guess more public work, more public engagement, more just speaking about these things out loud, and doing the boring things like writing little newspaper op-eds and stuff is possibly a way of just not shifting culture or engaging trust, but at least getting people talking. I guess that's all.
Right, I'm sorry to say it's 10:57, which means that we're going to have to come to the end of the Q&A. I'd like to point out that we are a practitioner and academic community. I think some of the talk we've had here is as if the academics, we're all sort of wonderful and thinking about this very carefully, and the practitioners are not. I can see practitioners in the room who are thinking about it just as carefully, if not more so. So I think we should beware of saying, oh, there's nasty commercial people and then there's the beautiful, pristine university people. We know it's not at all like that. So let's keep those dialogues going. But I'd like very much to thank Neil for his keynote. I saw a massive sort of series of tweets going on, all being sort of stimulated by the discussion. I saw discussions going on outside, and I saw the amount of interest in talking to Neil. I'm sure he'd be up for talking to you later once he's had a bit of a
I'll see you in the airport. I'll be there for hours by the looks of it.
But let's thank him very much.
So we've got a panel in here now.
There's a panel coming up here now.
Yeah.